All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Butler with FaithTrust Institute, and we are so delighted you're joining us for today's Meaningful Voices Book Club. I'll introduce our presenters in just a minute, but first we're going to go over a couple of technical details. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, I recommend that you make sure that your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, you should exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then reconnect again using that link. All audience members are muted throughout the process, which we are apologizing for, but we do want to hear from you. So if you have questions or comments, you can send them to me using the question feature on the right side of your screen. And you can submit those questions at any time, and then I'll insert them when there's a break in the conversation. If you don't see the question box, click on the little orange arrow on the top right of your screen, and that should expand the feature options. So again, send your questions anytime. We're looking forward to hearing what you think. Our presenters this evening, first is Marie Fortune. She's the founder and senior analyst at FaithTrust Institute, and she's written extensively on sexual violence, clergy misconduct, and is considered, just great. She's just great. Leah Lax is with us, and she is the author of Uncovered. She was raised in a Jewish family in Dallas, Texas, and she joined the Lubavitcher Hasidim and spent 30 years, had several children, and left the community when she was 45. She has published award-winning fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, prose poetry, and she is also working on productions for opera and with the Houston Symphony. And then last but not least is Toby Myers. She is referred to as the mother of the Texas Battered Women's Movement by the Texas Council on Family Violence. She helped found and has been active in many organizations ending violence against women. And she has worked, she's worked with attorneys as an expert witness. She has a counseling practice, and she's been on numerous boards and committees, trainings, providing technical assistance, and she wrote a Hanukkah blog for us this last year, which is on our website. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to our speakers. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much. And welcome to everyone for our discussion tonight of what I think is a very important book, Uncovered by Leah Lax. I'm really pleased to be joined by Leah, the author, and have a chance to talk with you directly about so much in your book. And also very pleased to be joined by my old friend, Toby Myers, who has been an important part of this work for so many years, and I consider a mentor and a dear friend as well. So the chance to be in this conversation with the two of you is very special for me. So Leah, we want to begin with your book, and as I was thinking about how to approach it, I thought somewhat linearly, because that's the way you wrote it in terms of your journey as a young adult, becoming part of the Hasidic community and what that meant for you, and marrying and having your family there. And then you began to question that choice on your part and all that went with it, and we want to talk some about that. You also began to discover your own sexuality as a lesbian, and the context in which that happened for you. You were faced with an excruciating decision about your own reproductive health and the choices that you had to make there. You also encountered within your own family and began to discuss with your family your experience of incest. And then you began to question deeply your place in the Hasidic community, your place in your family and the choices ahead of you as an adult. And you share that with us in a remarkable way in terms of just really beginning to unpack all that for us. So I remember when I first met you and was at the your launch of your book in Houston when I was visiting Toby, and Toby insisted that we had to come to this event, which I knew nothing about, but I was delighted to have the opportunity to come. And I remember as you were doing the reading, one of the things you said that I'd like you to comment on is that you realized that you had to wait until you weren't as angry before you could have written this book. And I wonder if you would say a little more about that as the context for your writing.
I think memoirs often come out of a schism. They're usually looking back on a previous period of your life, and you need that distance to be able to say, well, what was that? It was very important to me, and not to do what a lot of memoirs do, which is to say, oh, what a terrible experience I had, but that's all passing behind me. Look, I'm in a good place, and the proof is that I have the space and time to write a book about it. I don't feel that way. I feel that my past is part of me. That's why my name remained Leah, the Hebrew name I took on in the Hasidic world. I didn't go back to the English name I grew up with because I left using that name as a 16-year-old. My past is part of me. It's a big part of who I am. But there's a certain degree of anger after any schism, and I think it's important for women to own that anger and use it if you can tone it down enough to make it a useful tool. It's a very useful tool for a lot of things. But in terms of my writing, it was very, very important to me that all of the people in my book, meaning all the people in my life during the period I was writing about, were human and real. They had to be three-dimensional. And if I wrote from a standpoint of only that anger, not from the complexity that life is, then they'd be two-dimensional, and the story would be too. It would be a wash that would blow everything else away. So I had to wait a while.
So how long do you feel like you waited? Because you had started writing when you were still part of the community.
I wasn't writing my own story, or at least I didn't think I was.
Yeah.
I didn't start my memoir till, well, right now it's been 15 years since I left the community, but it took, I'm not getting the numbers right, around between 7 and 8 years to actually get the book published. And
Talk a
and
little
during that time I wrote and rewrote and rewrote. So, I probably started at 5 or 6 years out.
Talk a little about the publisher and what she said to you about the niche for this book.
I had one of the top and most respected agents in New York City, the kind of agent that says, don't bother writing a book proposal, because your book proposal is when I call the senior editor at your dream publisher and say, read this book, and she says, of course, courier it over to me. And that's what happened. The book sort of magically rose to the top of the pile, and I had senior editors and wonderful publishers reading my book, and they all would write beautiful responses within a week or two and tell me how much they loved it, but it's not for us. And that not for us was code for, this is a minority of a minority. We don't think that it will draw enough of a market share to be worth our time. But I didn't know that. So, and my agent made this her pet project and thought she could break that barrier, and she couldn't. Finally, one of those editors called me and said, you will never say my name, and I never have, but my friend broke out of mainstream publishing and started a press for women in which women are partners, full partners in the process. We become entrepreneurs. Their publishing standards are the same, so it's not a vanity press because they choose who they publish, and their standards are high, and they have their own artists for the book cover, which is gorgeous, all that. But she brings us on board and teaches us the business of writing, and we share in the expenses and we share in the profit. So they don't pay royalties either. I pay them a percentage, and it works out a little bit. I get a little bit over half.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different model, and I think it's a wonderful model. It's a very empowering model.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Toby, was that what you were remembering in her comments about the niche?
Yes, exactly. Thank you,
Yeah.
Leah.
Yeah.
And what I said that day was that those marketing boards and the mainstream publishers that refused my book, they take a concrete understanding of a market. If you write a book about fishing, they can only count on it being sold to people who fish. So my book is about what? A lesbian in Texas, a Hasidic woman in Texas, really? And a lesbian, right? So, that's like, who's it going to sell to? 3 people? And what I said to you guys that day was, that's not who I wrote my book for.
Right.
I don't need to write another coming out story for lesbians to read, or a book about Hasidic life for Hasidic women who live it day to day. I wrote my book for you. And I hope that it makes that leap to the vicarious so that you can experience something that you wouldn't have otherwise experienced. And in the process of reading it, catch the universal so that we can see that in so many ways we're the same.
Yeah. Which is what I really appreciate about the book, is that not only did I learn a lot, but I also kept flashing on the every woman aspect of it, in terms of you're really writing about women's experience of patriarchy in a particular setting, a particular time, and a particular faith community. But the issues that you encountered and that you struggled with, as far as I'm concerned, are there for all women who live in patriarchy, which most of us do, and in our own particular faith tradition, whatever it is. We have, a version of what you talk about. So that's why I was so amazed by that response by the editors. It's like, no, you really are missing the whole point here, and the market in terms of the potential there. How has it played out? Let's talk a little bit about that in terms of the response of the literary world.
I'm enormously glad this happened. The growth of my book has been grassroots. I've met people like you. I've had unusual responses from unusual places, like the FaithTrust Institute, like the composer who found my book and was moved to say, let's write an opera based on your book. I'm writing a libretto for it now.
Oh, wow.
I'm going to be speaking at the Boniak Institute for Religious Tolerance on the Rice University campus, and at several different university campuses, things like that. Psychoanalytic societies have picked it up. I don't know what's going to happen from day to day, so it's been great. Barnes and Noble has a process they call modeling, where they have to assign a book a topic, a label, a bookshelf, before they'll send the book out to their stores. And my book doesn't categorize. Like you said, is this a coming out story? Well, no. In my book you find a 16-year-old from a 60s liberal home. I was a public school kid, a Dallas kid, a Texas kid, who rebelled against her parents and rebelled by moving to the right, by the way, in the same way that kids were doing on campuses all over the country in the early 70s. I jumped into right-wing religion in college, or just before college, and then in college as well, at the same time that the Catholic Student Union and the Baptist Student Union, the Methodist Student Union were burgeoning, and they were all moving into more and more conservative approach. At the same time that Muslim kids were screaming on campus, demonstrating against the Shah, it was our rebellion against our parents. So I put the book very much in an American context in that phase. I mean, you see it. We were all ready to take our right-wing rebellion into the world, and we did. I mean, you know, we just had Super Tuesday, right? This is going back to the beginning of a process, but this is the story of one girl who was caught up in that. So it's not a lesbian story. It's a woman's story. It's an American story, but it's also a story, a very intimate inside picture of a very closed off fundamentalist religion. And I think there's a vicarious aspect, you know, to reading this book, because people, you often see communities like that, but you don't know their heart. You don't know the inside. So back to Barnes & Noble, they didn't know how to label my book. So they stay in the warehouse and they get sent to the Barnes & Noble stores only if people request it, because it doesn't categorize. A lot of my writing is that way, is it kind of leaps across many different boundaries.
Maybe they need a new category just for that.
Called uncategorized, I think.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. I think that would be great for marketing. Say a little bit more, if you would, about that attraction to the Hasidic community at that age, and kind of how you, what had been your experience growing up Jewish, what particularly drew you at that moment, and a little bit about that early part of the story, if you would.
My grandparents were, this part's not in the book, but my grandparents were immigrants, and as children, they grew up on the east side of New York, and they dropped out of school very young to make their own way, built a decent business together, and then lost everything in the Depression. So I grew up in a family that had migrated to Texas to survive, and a family that had left Europe and left everybody else behind. So we were very nuclear and very tight. My experience of being in an immigrant family or an immigrant-rooted family was completely bound up with my experience with being in a Jewish family, and I didn't know the difference. We weren't particularly religious, but deeply cultural and very intensely tied to one another, taught that family comes first. But I didn't know what family comes first means, because they very consciously threw away religion along with all their old world styles and along with the accent that they carefully worked to get rid of, etc. So who was I? I didn't know. I knew that I was in Dallas society, kind of, you know, upper class part of town, and I certainly didn't fit in with those girls, especially as they were maturing, right? They were all fluttering around the boys, and I was going, guys, why did you change? I don't even recognize you anymore. And why don't I speak your language anymore? I didn't understand. You know, there was that and the yearning for girls that I would never dare express. It was a different world. There was no media saturated with, you know, with gay language, whether you want it or not. There was no, it wasn't in at all. It was social death and terrifying to admit, and I didn't. So I kind of suppressed all that, but when I met the Hasidim, which was, you have to read the book, but it was a caprice of the weather that led me to meeting them completely. It rained that night and changed my life. I was blown away, and there were a lot of reasons why I was so deeply attracted to them. You know, I was from not only this immigrant home, but my mother was the first rebel against her, you got to go to work, you know, and be grown-up parents. She was an artist, and she was a very, very fine artist, very passionate, extremely talented, very lopsided in her abilities. I mean, that's like all she could do, but, you know, she ultimately had quite a career. So there was like no structure in our home, and it wasn't the best of homes to be from, or maybe it was a good home to be from. But I found a religion that said, here are rules, here are categories. Everything is clean and neat and in its place. There's structure here that you always craved, and now it is, and now here it is, 16-year-old. And by the way, if you follow the rules, you fit in the categories. You don't have to question who you are. We'll define it for you, ready-made. And what do you get for that? This all-encompassing parental eternal love. I mean, what could be better? It won't be intermittent. You won't always have the feeling that your parent might love something else better than you. It will be eternal and constant. That sense, that childish sense of needing structure and love and a self-definition when I had so many questions, that was big. But there was this other aspect. That I found the Hasidim, along with their passion and fervor, along with some of the most moving, heartfelt, soulful song that I'd ever heard that carried me away. I found an enormously homoerotic undertow, and I didn't know. I didn't put words to it. It was just years later, looking back, particularly when I first opened the page 1 to start writing this book, I went, oh my God, because the men separate from the women. The men stay with the men all the time. The women with the women. The men, part of their prayer is an ecstatic union with one another and with the Rebbe, where they put their arms around each other. They dance arm in arm out of sheer love. They sing together. They stay up late nights arm in arm and sing and bare their souls. They kiss one another openly, or they did then, because there was a more European influence on the community when I first came in. I don't think you see it as much now in the younger generation. I saw men openly kissing one another like that. I never saw that, and I loved seeing that. And the women on the sidelines whispering in each other's ears and also dancing together. And once I moved into the community, the women were their own community. It was a hard life for a woman physically, but we were always in each other's spaces, supporting and helping each other. Very hands-on, very co-mothering and that kind of thing. So there was all this homoerotic quality that, particularly as a teen, it was like, like that. I felt this toe pulling me in. And I didn't know. I just knew I was thrilled.
So, Toby, how does Leah's experience differ from your experience? I'm just curious how you react to that part of her story.
Well, my family, my mother was first generation. She has older brothers and sisters who were born in, quote, the old country, which my mother's family was from what's now Moldavia, and my father's family, which is now from Belarus. And they had a very hard life, and they were very structured together, but they weren't particularly religious. They were culturally very Jewish. And I told the story earlier. I was from Amarillo, which is not very Jewish, and when we first moved here, I wanted my kids to have a Jewish education, and they went to the Hebrew Academy, and I knew pork was not kosher, but I didn't know shrimp wasn't kosher, and I found that out. So we didn't have much shrimp in the old days in Amarillo.
So I'm sure you got a quick education on the proper diet.
Very much so.
So, Leah, in terms of as you entered into that community and you married, how would you describe your marriage as arranged? As say a little bit about that and your husband.
The Hasidic community, at least the Lubavitch Hasidic community in those days, practiced what I think of as sort of a qualified arranged marriage. And they considered themselves very forward-thinking and modern compared to the other Hasidic communities, and they are. The group I was in is just a small part of the larger Hasidic world, and most Hasidic communities have arranged marriage in which the two meet each other, in their parents' living room once, and then they meet again under the wedding canopy. And when they meet that once, either one of them is welcome to say no officially, but they're young and scared, and they don't know really. There's no way they can know the real answer.
Mm-hmm.
In our group, they have a system of what they call shidduchim, where they have matches recommended to them, and usually recommended by people that know the kids and really think hard and with a lot of love and care about how they should match up. And they go out alone, but only to public places, when they're expected to really talk their heart in a focused way. What do you want? What do you like? And kids in Hasidic homes will go home and discuss it with their parents, and their parents will say, "Well, are you attracted to him? And how do you feel?" They'll really try to make this work. And as a result, of that focus and combined with the tandem commitment to the religion, a lot of the marriages do work. In my case, I was at the university. We were members of the Hasidic Student Union. We were wannabe Hasidim, following sort of a bulleted list of a to-do list. You want to be a Hasid, this is what you do. And we were trying to teach ourselves how to say the prayers, and teach ourselves basic Hebrew, and teach ourselves the laws. And the rabbi would come in from Houston and give us classes, and he sat the man who would become my husband, he sat him down and said, "You're one of the oldest ones here, and you got to get married. And who are you interested in? And you're interested in her? Okay, I'll talk to her." And he sat me down and said, "Levi wants to marry you, and are you interested? And you should consider this." Well, we were also at that point, even though we were university students, we had separated ourselves from university society. We already were little soldiers of God. We already felt that we didn't have our own will. The will of God was primary, and that spoke through the law of God and the emissaries. And so this rabbi was basically saying, "You should marry him." So he proposed on the first date. We both knew it was a formality. It was really both of us succumbing to what we felt was our destiny. And we then asked the Lubavitcher Rebbe for his blessing, and we were married a few months later. The book opens in the wedding. The wedding was in my grandparents' home. So they hear my mother and grandmother trying to have a Dallas society wedding, and they really felt like these uninvited hillbilly relatives had shown up at their society wedding. These Hasidim, everything that the family had tried to leave behind. So I was grinning about that. I felt that they were very materialistic, the word of the age, the teen rebellion word of the age, and that I was going to live a life of the Spirit. I was going to rise above all that. I'd be the grown-up.
And how did your parents respond at that point?
Well, they made the wedding, but they were just beside themselves. They were very, very unhappy that I got into this world. And when I showed up the next day, having covered my head, because I put a wig on my head or a scarf, we never showed a hair of our head. So if you ever see a Hasidic woman and you think you see hair, what you're seeing is a very expensive wig, sometimes $6,000, $8,000. But when I showed up the next day, in the long clothes I had already adopted to adhere to the laws of modesty, with my head covered, my grandmother almost broke down in tears.
Mm-hmm.
That piece isn't in the book.
Yeah. Well, since your title is Uncovered, say more about the covering process, and especially for those of us who are not Jewish and not experienced that culturally, but say more about kind of what that means and what it means to you now, and why you titled the book this. this title?
We were taught, and the covering was introduced to me as the sign of nobility. Women were on a pedestal. Women were at a higher spiritual plane. Because of it, we were to dress like a princess would dress. That's what we were taught. But once covered, once you become socialized to keep your body covered and your hair covered all the time, if any of that slips, you feel nothing but shame. And shame might be foisted on you by the community if you don't consistently stay covered appropriately. No might about it. The gossip could be awful. It was not out of nobility. It was an explanation after the fact, because the real Jewish law is that men are not supposed to have to see any uncovered parts of women when they're in prayer, because it would distract them from prayer. So really what we were enjoined, and also only men, by the way, had the obligation to marry. We as women were enjoined to provide their needs. So we were to stay covered because they couldn't see us, not because we were to stay covered. In other words, it wasn't an act of prayer to God to cover ourselves. It was an act of compliance. For them not to look was an act of prayer. It wasn't an act of prayer to marry. It was an act of compliance. For them to marry was an act of prayer. It was fulfilling their destiny in the world. And so we had these very powerful subliminal messages every single moment, or this is how I feel, that says your body is something that needs to stay covered all the time. Your hair should be covered.
And in your early marriage, Leah,
And your voice.
Yeah, I think there's something called Kolbe Isha Irva, that woman's voice is like a bee. But one of the things I remember about the book, that there was first kind of trouble in this peaceful thing, and it centered around the place for your cello. Can you talk about that?
It's funny that you think about that in the same context with me talking or trying to answer Marie's question about being covered, and how being covered somehow shuts down your sense of yourself, makes you feel that you need to submit to the law, submit to the men, keep your voice covered, and that you can lose sight and touch or connection with who that person underneath the covering really is, because it needs to be covered. It's supposed to be covered. And connected with the covering was the rules, that part of the rules of modesty, that we weren't to sing in front of other people. There were never female public speakers at our public gatherings, our community gatherings. Our voices were very, in public, repressed. I'll talk a minute about how different it was inside the home. And for me, music was part of that. I mean, music was what drew me there. Music was the sound to me of a soul. And some of their nigunim, if I had half a voice, I'd sing to you, but really I'm going to spare you. Some of their nigunim are deemed the song of a soul, or the song of the journey of a soul into the world, and having to be exiled from God and trapped in a body that will drag it down into sin. You know, it's a love song. They're love songs to the soul. They're just so beautiful. And I would run and play them on my cello because it belonged there. It sounded perfect to me there. The cello was that voice for me. And I naively thought that being religious and playing my cello, one thing had nothing to do with the other. And I continued to play with great devotion after I first became religious until I was engaged. And one of the very first things I said on that night that he proposed was, what about my music? I want to, we'll have a home. I want a room for my music. And he said, I would really like that. The truth is, I married a man who loved classical music from his previous life. So he did like that. and I was comforted. I continued to play and study through the first year of marriage until my teacher, who unbeknownst to me had studied under Casals and played in Carnegie Hall, and ultimately had students that were first cellists in symphony orchestras all over the country. He wanted me to go audition for the Austin Symphony Orchestra, and I knew that, boom, this is it. The conflict has come. They play on the Sabbath. The women, their company costume was that the women wore these black cocktail pants. I wasn't allowed to wear pants. And I knew that those two things were just a symbol of the conflict, that the real secret was that if I put myself into music this deep, that music can and will carry me away. That's what it does to me. And I made a different kind of commitment. And so there's a scene in my book that I never read in public because I can't get through it, but it will be in my opera, in which I didn't show up. I simply didn't show up for the next lesson. And you see Mr. Olewski standing outside the studio looking at his watch, and then you see me at home with the music gathered around me, and I'm looking over lots of music I played over the years because I can read music and just hear the music in my head. And then I take the cello in my arms and I thank it and loosen one string at a time, and then I zip it up in its case and literally put it in the closet behind a line of long skirts. I've had a number of musicians tell me they read my book and that they heard it like music, and as if that cello line was there all the way through. And when a composer decided to write an opera, a chamber opera based on my book, my first words were, it's going to feature a cello solo. Like, what are your instrumentation? And it's piano and cello and oboe.
Well, that image is just incredibly powerful. And so it just stayed there till you left?
Stayed there all those years. Yeah.
Wow.
When I left, I took it with me.
And you took it up again, I assume? And
yeah, I mean, after I got out, after this book is over, I actually had a little career, and I had several different projects, and then one day, don't ask, this for a different webinar, it fell in my lap. I got a call from the Houston Grand Opera asking me to write a libretto for a new work, and I was like, you want me to what? Because I knew nothing about librettos and very little about opera. So it would take a while to explain how in the world that happened and what idiocy it was for me to say, I'm going to do this, but really? And the work, it was a work that comprised of the real voices of immigrants and refugees from all over the world. It was called The Refuge. So I worked on that for a year, and it put me back in music world. And that's when I took the cello out of the closet finally and started all over again. Never left it, never will.
Well, what response have you gotten from women or men from other faith traditions who have read your book? Particularly other more fundamentalist conservative traditions, or do you have a sense of that?
Not as much as I wish I did. When I can tell you when I speak in bookstores and venues like that around the country, it's usually only a minority of the crowd that comes that's Jewish. Most of them are from other faith traditions, and at every location, everywhere, there are always people who come up to me and say, let me tell you my story, or this reminds me of my faith. In that sense, yes, I get these snippets. I'm craving a much larger conversation because to me, women that, to me there's enormous overlap. And every faith tradition has a very right-wing side of it that asks women to cover themselves as part of their faith. Gloria Steinem put it very directly. She said religions that by definition rule women's wombs. I wish I could understand the connection between devotion to God and ruling women's wombs, but every faith tradition has it. They tell women to show your devotion to God, cover yourself, cover your hair, cover your voice. Part of your devotion is to marry young, and have unlimited number of children. We didn't mention my 7 children, or the fact that birth control was forbidden, and so they were born in a 10-year span. Mm-hmm. I wish I knew that connection, but because of it, I feel a deep connection to these women. That's why my book is dedicated on the dedication page to my covered sisters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I have a question from the audience here, and someone is talking about page 325. It's the scene, Leah, let's see, I'm just looking here, where you actually go up and put your hands on the Torah, and like suddenly you own this, these laws, this text that you've been living under, but you didn't own it. Like it owned you, but you didn't own it. And so she's asking if you'll respond to that.
Those are her words, right? That I didn't really own it, or what do you mean?
Well, what she's saying is that, like when you grab onto it, it's like it says here, I had an instant understanding of an ancient act of ownership, which, apparently you hadn't felt before that experience. So I guess she's asking about.
I didn't previously own it. Right.
Yeah.
Right. In Talmudic law, a significant portion of Talmudic law is devoted to the law of contracts, and when two people make a contract between one another, it was symbolic of acceptance of their mutual ownership and upholding of that contract to grasp it together, 2 hands, one of each from each person, and hold that contract up, lift it up, and as a statement of this binds us, this is a statement of truth, this is a statement of our ownership of this contract. And I was always taught that in that same sense, the Torah, which to our community meant, in a larger sense, not just the literal words of the 5 books of Moses, but all of the interpretations that came from it, and including all of the laws, the minutiae laws that govern our lives, to us that was all Torah, and officially all based on that Torah. And I was taught that Torah is a contract in the same sense, in the Talmudic sense, between God and the Jewish people. And every week at the prayer service, when a portion of that Torah was read, somebody would then take that Torah and after the reading of that week's portion, and raise it up in the air in that same sense, and act that reinforced the contract between us and God, a statement of ownership. But women, of course, we're not allowed to be on the men's side. We never went to the Torah. We never read it out loud before the community. We were just on the other side of the screen and listen. And of course, we never participated in that grasping. Oh, also, when the Torah is read, people on the Sabbath, individuals are honored. They go up and those handles, the wooden handles, because the Torah is this big scroll. It's handwritten on parchment, and it's scrolled around 2 wooden rollers. And someone goes up to the Torah. They grasp those wooden handles and they pronounce a blessing, and then the reader reads part of that week's portion. They do this 7 times. So in the same sense, that grasping of that wooden handle is that same, I own this is my contract. And then after the last person, another person comes up and actually raises it up. But it's as if they're all doing it, as if the community is grasping this and raising it up. This is my contract with God. I own this. I'm part of this. And women were not part of it. So I didn't understand the impact of that until I was in an act of rebellion, a secret act of rebellion, because I was still married, still Hasidic. I traveled to another city where I met the Jewish feminist author, still a dear friend to this day, Rachel Adler, who teaches at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles and was very pivotal in the early Jewish feminist movement in looking at Jewish religion and saying, this is so patriarchal. What can we do to hold on to and love our religion and yet reinterpret it and allow a place for women? She was so important in that. And it was Rachel that invited me to come to her synagogue and arranged for me to walk up to that Torah, be invited, and say the blessing before the community. And she picked out the section that was to be read, and I blanched when I was invited, and then terrified. I felt this is somehow a turning point in my whole life, something I have to do. And I begged her to go with me. I went up to the front of that community on that Sabbath service, and this Hasidic woman stood before a mixed gender community and put her hands on those wooden handles. And it wasn't about concept anymore. It wasn't about talk. I felt those wooden handles in my hand, and I knew that this was my people's ancient act of ownership, and that it wasn't just my job to stand by and support the men owning it, but this was my heritage. This is who I am. This is in my DNA. Whether I like it or not, whether I agree with the law, whether I comply with the law, this is part of who I am, and I own it. And then I opened my voice out loud, and I said the prayer before the community that is said when you do something for the first time in your life, the Shehechianu prayer. And I heard this resounding amen from this huge, and then as I was walking back to my seat stunned, people were shaking my hand and congratulating me. And I knew I couldn't go back. I knew that Jewishly, that in terms of my faith, that my faith and my contract with God from this point out was going to include my own voice. And that if I was re-evaluating my life, that re-evaluating my faith was going to be part and parcel of that. I could not separate the two. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does. But I felt that previously I did not own it as much as I was a part of it, and that now I did.
I love that story simply because my first cousin, Jim Coppersmith's wife, Laurel, is Rachel Adler's sister.
Oh, really? And I love Rachel. Isn't she an amazing person?
Did you feel after that any sense of guilt, or, I mean, as you were in that moment of, beginning transition and so forth and so on, that you had done that, or did you leave that behind?
Before I went up to that Torah that day, Rachel Adler took the talit, the prayer shawl, off of her head. Now, to me, that was a purely male symbol. I had never seen a woman wearing a talit, so I was very embarrassed to come in and find her wearing that. Mm-hmm. And before I went up to that Torah, she took it off and she put it on me. And again, it wasn't about concept anymore. It was experiential. It was without words. I felt that shawl wrapped around me, and I instinctually did what I'd seen the men in my community do for many, many years. They pull it down over their face and wrap it around and go inside a tent and say the blessing. And by doing so, they form a prayer space, a portable, personal, private prayer space between them and God. And I didn't know that until that moment when I did it myself. I went, oh my God, this isn't about men. This isn't about women appropriating men's symbols. This is a Jewish prayer space. This is mine. And I didn't know what this was until I was in it. And I wore that tallit up to the front. So when it was over and everyone congratulated me, I went and sat down. I pulled that tallit down over my face and made that private space, and I cried my eyes out. Sat there and cried. And the following week on the Sabbath, when I was back home in the community, back into mom mode, I sat my family down around the Sabbath table and I told them what I had done. And I don't think that piece is in the book. They were speechless. But I had to tell them. It was preparing the way for me to leave. But I didn't even know that yet.
Yeah. What was your husband's reaction?
Dismay, but he didn't say anything.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so let's move on.
Well, I
sorry.
actually have a question, another question for the audience.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts for other women who are in a community where they don't have a voice?
Yeah, I absolutely do. In a community like that, you can't change overnight, and you can't change your community. At least you can't change it overnight. But find something you can change, something very small, and do it now. One small thing. And then go and read and read and read women's voices. Hear them. And then make another very small change. Don't stay in one place. When you feel stuck, you usually feel that it's overwhelming. But there's always one small step you can take. For me, I couldn't tell my whole community that I did that, but I could swallow hard, and with great fear, I could tell my family. I couldn't uncover my body, but I pushed my scarf back about an inch after that. It was small, but it was very powerful for me. And every time I took a step, after a while of holding on to that one step, I knew what the second step was going to be. I didn't know the third one, but each time, after a while, I knew the next one.
Did you share that experience or any of these pivotal experiences with women friends who are part of the community?
Oh, God, that's another thing I was going to say. You know how in our crazy, diverse, be all you can be yourself society, women tend to cluster and be each other's support systems so that, you know, lots of women have girlfriend stories where you get together, I don't know, after work for a drink or on the telephone or something, and those women's spaces are the place where you, oh, I don't know, complain about your husband or your kids or your job, or say things like, you won't believe what he said this time, you know, or I'm thinking about the craziest thing. What do you think? I might quit my job. I might even start a whole new career. You know, so using that women's space not only as a place to admit your doubts and questions or faults or anger, admit your anger, but also as a place to float a trial balloon of things you might do that are going to require courage. Those women's spaces are really important. But in a homogeneous society, like a faith community, for us to belong, the way we belong was by demonstrating conformity. The whole society wrapped around an ideal. And our identity was formed much more as a group identity than as an individual. We weren't going to admit those things to anybody. To say, oh my God, do you know what my husband did? Or I don't think I like my kid today. Or I'm thinking about trying something new, or I might even get a divorce. To say things like that, or to admit your doubts, which include doubts in faith, to admit where you're not conforming, and basically are saying, my identity is not really what it is. So it causes a huge, first of all, it undermines, to do something like that questions your status and belonging in the society. So it's a threat to the whole society. There will be pressure to get you to conform so that the society can continue, and it won't be pretty. But it also causes this huge internal existential shattering of, oh my God, if I am not these people, who am I? Because my group identity is paramount. I don't even, underneath all that, it wasn't that important to figure out who I am, and if that's what I'm left with, I don't know who I am. So we didn't have girlfriends, and we didn't support each other. That kept us in place too. So the next thing I would say hugely is find a female friend outside the community, someone that you can trust, someone who isn't going to start gossip in the community, someone that you could speak to. Anyone.
Will you talk about your venture and how brave it was to come to the first Jewish feminist conference?
Well, this was after I did that thing of going to the Torah in California and then went home and tried to go back into my normal world because my kids were expecting and waiting for it. And it created this inside-outside situation where I couldn't just go back to sleep. Something inside me had been uncovered. And it was hard. It was hard staying there. I was getting antsy. And then a friend of yours, Toby, this story only came to light many years later, but you and Sandy Block and Julia Mazo and a number of people here in Houston, meanwhile, were getting wind of all this Jewish feminism and this movement within the religion to give women a place and a voice in this very patriarchal religion and push for change, etc. A movement that, by the way, has been enormously successful, and it's transformed the Reform branch of Judaism and in many ways the conservative branch. But you guys were decided to do this conference that you're going to call the First Texas Conference on Judaism and Feminism. There never was a second one.
No, we had two. You may have come to the second one. I'm not sure, but if it was the first, then we had two.
Okay. And in so doing, one of your group decided to look for a Hasidic woman to speak. I don't know why you decided that. And I didn't know any of this was going on. I just know that at home in my little bubble, because I describe that life as walking around in a glass box. You out there were not three-dimensional. You were cardboard cutouts. I didn't connect with you. I didn't dare, and I never showed you my heart, and my life was just contained inside the glass box in this Hasidic world. Even when I went to the grocery store or my husband went to work, it didn't matter. The kind of glass box moved with us, metaphorically speaking. So all I knew was that one day this brochure arrived in the mail inviting people to submit papers to be presented at the First Texas Conference on Judaism and Feminism, or maybe it was the second one. And all I knew was that it niggled and niggled and niggled and niggled at me. That how could these women even think of such a thing? To me, that was a contradiction in terms. Judaism meant not having a voice. It meant submitting to the law. And these are women who said, we're going to title it with feminism first, feminism and Judaism, and we're doing it to challenge that law. It was obvious. I was just, on one hand, I wanted to defend everything my life had been. On the other hand, I was fascinated and wanted to see how they dared. And so I proposed coming and speaking because we were an ecumenical movement. So it was okay to go into these spaces as long as we were going to preach.
Huh.
So I proposed going and basically speaking to these women and defending our position. Didn't work very well.
Toby, what do you remember about her speaking?
Well, I'm not sure I even heard her, but I remember she said, "I don't remember you, Toby." And I said, "Well, I remember you because you kind of stood out."
Because she was the only Hasidic woman there?
Correct.
Yeah, yeah. And how were you received in your speaking?
Oh, I was in way over my head. And
But
they
I think
challenged.
everybody was polite, were they not? I think people were polite to you.
Yes, they were polite. They asked a lot of questions that I had that pulled me off of my scripted speech. And our speech about Judaism was always 100% scripted in our heads. So it was really something to find myself deviating from the script and speaking a spontaneous answer when they challenged things like the mechitza division in the synagogue, the screen between the men and the women, etc. But what really threw me was that this woman stood up in the question and answer period, took them, I guess I remember, a microphone and said, "I am the president of a gay and lesbian synagogue, and I want to know where, in your conception, as if I owned it, as if I had a voice, as if I had any control, where in your conception of Judaism is a place for me?" And this was my greatest fear. This was my most repressed self. It wasn't so repressed anymore that I was fighting, standing up embodied in front of me. And I was completely exposed before them. I couldn't but answer. And I had to say to her, "There isn't. I don't have an answer for you." And I was speaking to myself.
So say a little bit more at that period about your coming to be aware of your sexuality and begin to, how you began to name and acknowledge that.
I'm learning labels after the fact, and I laugh at them because, I lived all my life without labels. I don't need them now.
Yeah.
But if I talk to a young person who defines everything in terms of labels, they get it if I tell them I'm kind of gender queer, meaning my psyche is not clearly female or male. I'm not a transgender person. I love my body. Transgender people, I don't have a condition. I don't have a tragic condition. I have a very joyous condition. I love my body just the way it is. Thank you. But when I dream at night, for example, I could be male as often as I could be female in my dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And when I try to wrap my head around a female psyche or a male psyche, I never can quite understand the difference between the two, except at the polar opposites. I'm both. And so there were the dreams that I was a boy that I had all my life, and then through my marriage there were the at times seriously erotic lesbian dreams. And when you wake up in a Hasidic house, when you go to sleep at night and you put on your headscarf and you put on your long sleeve nightgown and you prepare the hand washing water beside the bed and you get into your bed that is separate from your husband, because there are many times a month that you need to sleep separately from him, and modesty even enters the bedroom. And when you wake up in that environment from an erotic lesbian dream, sit up in bed in the middle of the night in a panic attack with your Hasidic headscarf still is on your head, and your bearded husband gently snoring on the other, in the other bed. It's pretty hard to find a context for it other than what it really is. It just, you can't, I mean, it's shocking, and you can't escape it. And I tried. So I developed a really chronic insomnia that I tried very hard to fight for a long time. That insomnia was great because, and I mean, I probably went 15 years without sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours at night. And so I was sort of chronically tired, but knew how to function that way. It was great because I started writing at night through those hours. And writing at night, all of the sort of enormous social pressure around me was much more muted, and it became an escape. I credit being a lesbian and that irrepressible sexual core with giving me a voice and helping me come to terms with myself and leaving the community. And I hope that other women who feel the need can find something equally joyful to latch on, that's at their core, to latch onto, and allow it to, allow it to sing. So I'm feeling sorry right now for the women that, that want to leave that aren't lesbians. So.
Well, there is a question here about, there's someone that you interviewed for, I think it was the Mikvah Project, who was very open to herself that she was a lesbian and that she was going to marry this man and go into this life, and that she spent her entire life, her duty was to suppress this. Can you talk a little bit about the way that she approached the same issue?
Oh my God. That was the part of the book where I was doing a project called the Mikvah Project. I made friends, or I re-met someone that I had been very briefly friends with in my teen years, just before I went like under the veil, so to speak. And she resurfaced and had made a life as an artist, a very fine portrait photographer. And I was writing those stories that, I started writing fiction stories during those hours of when I couldn't sleep. And I shared a story with her about a woman going, it was a story that had happened to me. A woman had asked me to take her to the mikveh when she wasn't married, and she didn't want to immerse according to Jewish law. She just wanted the immersion experience, and she wanted to feel for her own needs. She was a damaged person and had been abused, had suffered sexual abuse, and she wanted to feel that the religion cleansed her. And I had taken her to the mikveh, and I didn't know where to put it. Those hours at night, I started writing not just my secrets, but secrets I knew other people were holding. I had lots of stories that were full of secrets, and I was hiding them under my bed, literally. I was printing out, deleting them, and hiding them. But I shared that story with this photographer friend, and she wanted to start exploring why people go to mikveh, and I accompanied her. We started interviewing people. This was my way of hearing other women's voices when I couldn't yet find my own. And it was very, very important to me to travel around and find religious women who were doing the monthly immersion required of a wife to purify herself after her menses before her husband's allowed to touch her, and hear how they really felt about this process. Because many of them had made it their own, had transformed the immersion into a feminine prayer, the mikveh itself, a women's space. They had gone far beyond just, I am going to submerge myself in the water of God and purify myself from my husband. And in this woman's case, she would stand in the mikveh every month and pray with all her heart that she could that the water would wash that resistance to a fully intimate life with her husband, would wash it away. That she would go under the water a lesbian and come up a heterosexual woman. This was her monthly prayer.
Mm.
And she hadn't given up hope that it was going to work. And she would say, this is my job, my spiritual practice. You work at it and you remove and you remove and you remove. When she said those words, this visceral flush came over me and I couldn't speak. And I had to stop her and turn off the recording and walk away and be able to breathe. Because I saw a woman who was saying she was happy, whose body language was sad, saying the life was beautiful and her clothing was drab, saying that her spiritual practice being close to God was really, I kept picturing a scalpel, that she was working and working to cut away part of her core. And I couldn't breathe. I couldn't breathe. I saw myself. She showed me what I had refused to see in the mirror. It was rough.
Amazing. Yeah. It gives even deeper meaning to the whole issue of, ex-gay ministry and trying to pray away the gay or whatever. That certainly is part of the Christian experience for LGBT people.
Oh, it's not just the Christian experience. There was an organization just like that was just taken down by an ex-Hasidic gay young man named Chaim Levin that had the exact same approach.
Mm-hmm.
But pray away the gay. Your sexuality, our sexuality, every single one of us is absolutely at the core of who we are. It is part and parcel of our soul, if you believe in a soul. And who would want to pray away their soul? And Judaism teaches that the soul is a chelek Elokah mima'al. It's actually God in you, a part of God, God that is unified and complete and whole, not divisible into parts, and yet God is present within us, that soul is God. So why would anybody want to pray away the essence of who they are? And still, as part of religion, it's a paradox. Okay, I'm sorry I went on a rant.
No, but my question on top of that is, why would any religion ask us to do that? I mean, you know what I mean?
It's the same religion that asks women to give up the essence of who they are, to give up our voices, to give up our bodies. It's the exact same concept.
Right. Which I've come to term religion in service to patriarchy, because it's really doing the work of patriarchy, and I have to believe that's not the essence of any of our traditions, but it has become that or been co-opted or allowed to be used in that way.
Well, and it's the whole thing of seeing menses as impure.
And then there's that, yeah.
Which comes out of an old fear, that's all.
Yeah.
Well, and I think so. I think in the old times, when somebody bled, it meant they were wounded. And here were these creatures that bled every month, and they were fine.
I mean, we all have a visceral fear of blood that's not menstrual blood. That's a different creature. And that kind of brings me to what the turning point in my book was. And I don't want people to feel that, oh, now they've heard the book. So I have to assert 1,000 times that there's an enormous amount that I'm not saying here.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly not drawing the connection between the points. But I did become pregnant one time too many. And in that same sense that I could not cut away who I was, that that I had to own who I was and live it fully. I had to own my body. I had this very, very powerful reaction to that pregnancy. My 8th, at that point, my baby was, I don't know, maybe 2 months, 3 months old, and he had been born premature. And the child before him was 13 months old. He was 11 months old when the baby was born. And my oldest was under 10 years old. And they're all at home. So I was beyond exhausted. And I found I was pregnant again. I had that premature baby because I was ill too, from, just stress-related stuff. I had asthma. And my reaction was visceral. I walked circles around the house, and it wasn't me saying it. It was a deeper conscious me going, get it out, get it out, get it out. This is going to kill you, over and over. Like I went into, my body went into serious fight or flight mode. Me, religious woman, me who had laughed at lines of women at those clinics, with their irresponsibility that they felt that they could conceive and then discard at will and be sexually immodest. That was our viewpoint. And it was this Hasidic mother going, you will die. You must end this pregnancy. Well, Judaism actually allows for abortion under very, very restricted circumstances. It's not yes or no. And if it's a serious threat to your life or well-being, a rabbi will allow it. But I didn't have a heart condition or something. This was not logical. And when I stood back, I knew that the get it out, you will die, was that even if I didn't physically die, I would spiritually die. It would break me, that I could not deal. I could not cope with another infant. And that was huge. I heard that voice for the first time and heeded it because it would not allow me, my own consciousness would not allow me otherwise. And for the first time in my adult life, I said, no, I will do this because I will be a mother to my children. I must survive as a whole and healthy person, even if the law doesn't allow it. For the first time, I said, I will own this decision. It was huge. But then, of course, when I told my husband, he fell apart. And, of course, to appease him, I agreed to ask a rabbi. And I did it knowing I was lying because I knew if the rabbi didn't allow it, if he said, it's not dangerous enough, you know what, you want a permission to kill a baby because motherhood is difficult? I mean, I knew I might get an answer like that. I knew I would do it anyway. So I felt to a certain extent going along with that was lying.
Mm-hmm.
We asked the rabbi in order to, keep our home together, and he allowed it. And I'll regret that my whole life.
What part do you regret?
It should have been our great and terrible responsibility to end and choice and decision. The weight of that decision should have been ours to end the life of our child in order to survive. And in that moment, when the rabbi took that responsibility away from us and chastised us like children, in that moment, I realized that as Hasidim or as any religious people who submit themselves wholly to religious law, we were children, and we were never going to be able to grow up in these circumstances because the law and the rabbis and God, they were the parents, they made the choices. We went to them to tell us the decision, and that decision was a statement of right from wrong. So to us, right and wrong, good and bad, there was clarity. When really as an adult, there's no clarity whatsoever. And we have to face choices that are a mix of good and bad and good and evil, and make a choice even knowing the consequences, accept the responsibility of those consequences, and walk forward and do it without putting that weight on anyone else. That's being an adult. And I knew in that moment we would never grow up, and that I had missed a life opportunity to grow and deepen and enrich my life that I would never have again, or hoped to never have again. But I missed it. I gave it away. And then, of course, the rabbi said, you should have the abortion, but don't ever tell anybody, so that I have to always tell this story.
And say a little bit more about what that was about and what that felt like for both you and your husband to be told, yes, you can do this, but don't tell. Keep the secret.
He was a good soldier of God. He never spoke about it again, but he grieved. And it became something between us, this phantom child that had died to keep me alive, that he lost and could never speak of. He didn't speak of his grief. I didn't speak of the changes in me that came over me because of it. Mm-hmm. And there was already a distance between us, but I think it grew immeasurably after that.
Mm-hmm. And in the community, did you have any sense that at that point that you wanted to tell anyone, or how did that sit with you at that moment?
I didn't want to live with the secret alone. It was terrible. It was a terrible weight. And I had to go to mikveh, and I had a scar. So I chose someone that I felt I could trust, and I told her what had happened and that it was completely according to Jewish law. The rabbi had required it, had ruled it, and asked her to accompany me to that particular immersion. But we never discussed it any further. She was kind at the time, so I had that momentary outlet, but of course it was never going to engender a conversation. Mm. It's not like out in the world where a friend would go, oh my God, and are you doing okay? Or, or how are you feeling? And I'm sorry, honey. No, that wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen.
Hmm. So could we just briefly, I wanted to ask you to talk about the abuse in your family as part of where you came from, and then when you began to deal with that with your siblings. And I think that the thing that struck me about it, if I might go to that section, I was just so surprised, but also disturbed when you and your sister talked about the incest, and then you went back to Lebe and told him, right?
Right.
And I'm on page 222. I tell him everything that your sister and you had talked about. When I finish, Levi laughs out loud in a mirthless guffaw. No way, he says, and turns back to his book. My mouth drops open. I try to tell myself he's just shocked, off balance from the news. His parents are good people, so he doesn't have such things in his vocabulary. He doesn't know what to do with such information. No, it's true, I tell him. He sniffs, he purses his lips like sour lemons. I don't believe it, he says. That was just stunning to me.
Yeah, it was to me too.
Yeah.
I began to understand also that as two people who had adopted that life, both of us had said that we could create our own reality. We moved into a religion that constantly spun stories, biblical stories, pithy moral stories, all kinds of stories. Hasidic stories are famous. And they created a world. We were spinning our own reality. And he was really good at that. And when he said, I don't believe it, he was saying, I get to decide. I get to decide my faith. You want me to have faith in that? I don't have any proof, so it requires faith. No, that doesn't fit here. I'll just close the door. And I don't think it was just true of him. I think it was true of all of us, except that this was something I couldn't just close the door on. I think at some level I wanted to go into that world, to leave my family out there and build a family in a place where there were rules that everybody had to follow so they'd all behave and no one would hurt anyone. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, I think I was successful. So those categories and those rules were in some ways a screen to keep my family out. But after my sister said that, told me that, and I began to understand to what degree, through my childhood, without my knowledge, my sister protected me over and over and over. Yes, she did it by taking my father's hand in the hallway at night as I slept and taking him away from me to her, and live with the guilt that she was afraid that she had failed, that she hadn't always woken up. That's what brought her to me, to finally tell me. Mm-hmm. I left there and I didn't know about it, any of it. Not because if my father abused me, which he probably did, I was very small. I have weird, dreamy, sleepy kind of images in my mind. And it probably happened in my sleep. Mm-hmm. But it probably happened. I'm not going to go into details about, how I threshed that one out. But when I went home from my sister, I felt this is some of the truest love I have ever felt in my whole life. And I didn't know. Mm-hmm. And when I stepped over that threshold back into my home, I took my family in with me, including my father, my mother, everybody, as flawed as they were, because they were part of who I was. Mm-hmm. I knew that now. And it was in that situation that Levi said, I don't believe it. And I could no longer do that. I was no longer willing to do that. Mm-hmm. So it was an act of betrayal. It was another moment that split us. So you see, my leaving that world had so many layers. And it's not just a coming out story. I mean, I don't mean just. Mm-hmm. The coming out part, the lesbian part, that's like the saving grace. And it's a joyous thing. But there's so many levels because, well, for a lot of reasons, but as a covered woman and one subjected to the law for so many years, my adult formation was there. To be able to unhook like that and come to my own voice, it was going to take many layers and a lot of work to move into that. So well, in a sense, he did me a favor, didn't he?
Well, you stopped him from defining your reality. He was defining your reality, and you got to define it yourself.
It's true. Mm-hmm. That, with the abortion and then with my sisters coming out to me about the incest in my home, those are 2 points where the patriarchy could not, as represented by my husband, yes, could not define my reality. Those were those and the dreams I was having, those were things I could not reframe. I could not mist over. I could not redefine. They simply were. And why couldn't they be? Mm-hmm. Why shouldn't they be? So, yeah, you're completely right. I think my book is on a happy note.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And on that note, we do need to conclude this delightful hour and a half that we've spent together. But I did want to ask you in conclusion, in your epilogue, you quote Flannery O'Connor, which I thought was wonderful. One of my favorite authors. And your quote is, "Your beliefs will be the light by which you see, but they will not be what you see, and they will not be a substitute for seeing." So why did you choose that quote for your epilogue?
Because everybody told me that I was leaving a faith. And I even had a piece of this book earlier in an anthology written by women from many faith communities, all of whom had left their faith communities. And they titled the anthology, I objected to this, they titled it Beyond Belief. But I felt that I had been free to move toward a much more honest belief, a belief system that was honest to myself. And that very much could be like a watchword of those lines of where I wanted to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly resonated for me, I must say. And let me just thank you, Leah, and thank you, Toby, for being a part of this conversation. And I do want people to, if any of you listening who haven't read the book, you must read it, because it is a joyful book. And I always have found the joy in truth-telling, even truth that is painful, because it brings us to a new place in our lives. And I think you've done that with this book in just a remarkable way. And thank you for sharing it with us and for putting it out there in the world. I think it's a tremendous contribution. So thank you both. And Sarah, do you need to conclude us here?
Well, I just want to ask everyone as they leave the webinar or the book club to fill out the survey and give us your feedback, give us any ideas for other books in the future. And our next book club is going to be on May 18th. And the book we've selected is Lived Through This, Listening to the Stories of Sexual Violence Survivors by Anne Ream. So that should be a really great conversation. And please join us on May 18th. So that's the story. Thank you all so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.